Hi there. Good. I think I'm live going and just such a appreciation for being able to be part of this presentations and to be part of the Global Grief Conference. This is just, there's been so much incredible learning happening and just incredible resources being shared. And so I hope as a participant, you're finding some things that are helpful for you today. My name is Carla Mitchell, and I am here today to deliver a presentation called Children Grieve 2, Exploring and Supporting Children's Grief. So I believe I have some slides that will come up, and oh, there they are. And we'll be able to kind of follow along and with some slides. I'm just gonna make sure that they work. They do. So my name, first I wanted to start off just with a big thank you to Tony and Dee and all of the amazing speakers that have been part of this day, this time together, actually multiple days. It's been just an incredible opportunity and lots to learn. And also a big thank you to Nathan and Josh at Chicken Fox Productions for helping us out with the technical ends of doing such a large scale event and bringing this information to you in your own home or wherever you happen to be joining us from today. So thank you to everyone. And to set intention for our time together today, I am coming to you with some information about children's grief and supporting grieving children. And I hope that you're able to take away some things from today that might be helpful. We're going to cover a lot of information and what information you take from today and what is meaningful and works for you and your family is good. There's no perfect way to help children, aside from if you're coming with a good heart and you're wanting to provide that kind of support and be open to grief support for children, you're on the right steps. So all the information, take away what's meaningful for you today, and I hope you're able to find some resources and support. But yeah, I hope everyone has a coffee and they're settled in and prepared. So I'm Carla Mitchell. I'm a social worker. By trade, I'm also an end-of-life doula and a death educator. I am very passionate about helping people explore and understand death, and a big believer that our communities can become able to support grieving people and be able to kind of cradle and hold space for people if they're able to see death as a natural and a normal part of our lives. So a big part of the work that I do in as a social worker and as a death educator, and now also as a children's book author, is to support people in just normalizing that experience and finding words to talk about death and about grief, and just making that space a normalized space for them. I'm also a fellow griever myself, so I know a lot of us come to this line of work because we've experienced losses in our own life, and we learn things from it. And so, yeah, I do have I'm coming to you from the other side of grief as well. And as a mother that has to support my own grieving children, I have 3 young children, and over the course of the last few years, we've experienced the loss of a grandparent, and I've learned a lot in terms of supporting their journeys and supporting their grief. And that was kind of what led me to starting to write children's grief storybooks, and learned a lot along the way that I'm hoping to share with you today. So I come at that with a clinical practice, but also as a mother and a parent who's been there before, supporting grieving children. It's not easy, and there is support out there. So I hope if you take anything away from today, that will be what you take away. The learning objectives for today is we're going to talk a lot about preparation being protection. We're going to talk a little bit about ages and stages, what to expect with grieving kids, how do they understand death. We're going to talk about some really concrete ways of the words you can use and the things maybe to consider when you're talking about death with children. We're going to look at a concept called the 5 C's. So those are the 5 most common concerns that children have when they are experiencing a death and when they are going through grief. There's some common concerns that kids have. So how can you know what those are and also provide reassurance to them? And hopefully I won't run out of time. I'm hoping to do a live reading of one of the books from my storybook collection called I Am Here For You, a story to support your grieving child through death from suicide. So it's a lot of ground to cover, and hopefully you have a notebook handy, or you can take a look at these slides later. And at the end of the presentation, if you do have questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box, and I'll do my best to answer them at the end or connect with you via emails or some of our social medias kind of at the end. So let's start with this idea that preparation is protection for kids. We still live in a society where death and grief and all things end of life is a bit of a taboo subject. We don't like to talk about death and dying as adults, where there's a big discomfort in talking about death and also talking about the grief process and how hard that can be. It wasn't really, though, that long ago in our history that death was a normal and an expected kind of daily part of our lives. Prior to the inventions or the growth of the healthcare industry and the funeral industry, we really did do a lot of death care in our own homes. We would care for our aging family members. They would die in our home. A lot of our death rituals would happen. We would wash bodies and be able to have our families gathered with us during that time. And then also participate in funeral rituals as well. But over the course of not so distant history, we've really been lost track of that. We don't see death up close and personal in our daily lives anymore. And we don't participate as much as we used to in a lot of those rituals that we used to have. But it really wasn't that long ago. And when you don't have the language to talk about death and grief, and you don't have that kind of experience, it becomes something that people get a little bit fearful of. And I think that's kind of where we are now as a society. We're, as adults, very uncomfortable with death. We're uncomfortable with grief and all of the feelings, even though it's a very natural and a normal thing. We just kind of lack the ability to talk about that and support each other in that as adults. It's especially hard to do that with children. We really have a hard time with that, talking about death with children. And there's a lot of things, there's a lot of myths. We often think that if we talk about death with children, we're going to upset them, or we're going to cause them to have really deep-rooted problems because it's too hard or it's too scary for them. And so we often don't talk about children. We avoid talking about death and grief with children. And that urge to protect is a natural part of who we are. I know as a parent myself, even though I know all of this information by nature of the work that I do in the clinical practice that I have, when I had to explain death of a grandparent to my own children, That urge to protect them and not want to tell them this information was so strong. And I think, you know what, that's natural and it's normal. And it's important if you're a parent to know that a lot of research has been done to say that honesty with kids is the best policy. So even when information is really, really hard and it's difficult, children who receive clear and concise and honest information and truthful information, their grief patterns and their grief process, their ability to take all of that in and process their grief, it truly is improved. And so, despite our society and despite our urge to protect, setting up our children with the ability to understand death and understand grief and process that information truly does set them up for a lifetime of being able to handle and process their losses and their grief. Um, and what we know with children is that children tend to, when they do experience a death when they're young, they have they have a regrief that happens. And so regrief really means children understand death differently at each stage of development. And as they grow and they understand death better and how that death impacted on their lives, they're likely to grieve again and again and again as they kind of grow and understand death. So, a child who loses someone at the age of 3 might grieve again at 6 when they're learning about family concepts. They might grieve again when they get their driver's license. They might grieve again when they graduate, when they get married. And we know that for adults, grief is a lifelong process that changes over time. And for children, that is also true. So, you want to set your child up with that a good start to let them know that this is part of something that they can talk about and give them the skills to work towards processing their feelings. So, what does death mean to a child? I think sometimes it's really important to remember when we're adults that kids' understanding of death is very different. Children, the way that they understand death is flavored or colored by their age, also by their experience. So kids, some of their only concepts about death might come from what they see on TV or the video games that they play. They might have some experience. Maybe they've had experienced the death of a pet or a distant neighbor. Or maybe they grew up on a farm where life and death and the circle of life is kind of a part of their life. Or maybe they had a goldfish and that might have been their first experience with death. A lot of that also depends on how open their parents are, their caregivers are to talking about death and normalizing this experience. But we know for a lot of kids, they may never have even seen death or heard about death. And so it's a really big concept for them, and it might be something that their starting point for understanding might be based on things that aren't realistic. So, like for example, they might see people, their characters on television will die, and then they come back in the next scene, or um, things like that that aren't necessarily setting them up for what the reality of grief might be, or they might have no experience at all. The other thing that really does influence children's understanding of death is that their developmental stage. And their developmental stage does depend on things like their age and their experience. So every kid's a little bit different about when they pick these concepts up and really truly understand them. But for a child to understand death, they need to understand four big concepts that are developmentally kind of growing in their brain and things that they're thinking about. And that would be the idea that death is irreversible, so it's permanent. A lot of kids, you might hear them say, like, oh, well, when are they coming back? And that's because they don't understand permanence. They don't understand that death is irreversible. A lot of children don't understand the finality of it all, so that the body functions stop working and that they won't start working again. So children may worry about the person that died being in pain, for example, or they might worry that they can kind of have this idea that they could come back to life. So children don't understand that death means the body functions stop working and that they don't start working again. Kids also need to develop the concept of inevitability. And this is a hard one for a lot of kids to understand, that death is universal and it happens to all people and it happens to all things that are alive, so pets and bugs. And for children, that is a concept that maybe they don't understand, especially when they're very young and they kind of grow to understand that. And the final one is the causality, that death happens because of something physical that happens in the body. So, a lot of kids, when they're understanding death, they might be thinking that something that they did might have caused the death to happen. They might be thinking that if they, work harder at school, that their person will come back again, or if they might worry that maybe they weren't listening to their sister and brother having a fight, and then now this person is dead and it could be their fault. So as kids kind of understand those four concepts, their understanding of death grows and develops. But it's really important as adults, when we're trying to help grieving kids, we need to remember that they don't understand really what death is. And slowing down and really exploring those concepts and being really concrete, giving descriptions of death and what's what we're going to talk about in this presentation, can be so helpful for them. So it's really important to remember that as adults, the baseline that kids have for understanding death is different than the baseline we have as adults. And so part of our responsibility to a grieving child is to help them meet them where they're at, and set our expectations accordingly. So, how kids grieve, I think it's always a good idea to have some ideas about ages and stages. Every kid is unique, though. Just like adults, their understanding of grief and how this all plays together and is put together, it's flavored by a lot of things. But in general, a good general kind of guidelines here. From 0 to 2, kids don't understand that concept of death, and they're not going to be able to form kind of long-term memories of that person. But we do know that all children of all ages, including infants and babies, they do grieve because they're very sensitive to changes in their environment and to stress. This is particularly true if the person who died was a main caregiver. So if it was their mom or their dad, or maybe a grandparent or someone who was really close to them, they can definitely pick up on that change of the caregiver being away. And they also will pick up on their environment. So if everyone is very upset and very sad, you'll see that an infant and baby can pick up on those. So you might see them crying and clinging, being more anxious around strangers, and a regression. So their sleep patterns might change, eating and those kinds of things. To support a grieving child at this age, of course, providing them with comfort and making sure their needs are met. And keeping routines as best as you can, and just providing that really secure comfort approach can be super helpful for babies. And of course, it's going to become your responsibility to tell stories of that person that they lost, to keep that relationship alive through memory sharing. Because, like we talked about, that concept of regrief, even infants and babies, when they become aware of the fact that they've lost someone, maybe their mom or their dad, they do then grieve that when they understand, and they'll grieve that as they get older. So even if it's a baby, it's really important to set that foundation of support by keeping the memory alive. Sharing stories, videos is a lovely way. Kids age 2 to 4, they're really interested in death, or they're starting to develop this awareness of death and that it's something that happens. And they're trying to start with those four concepts. It's starting to build in their minds. But kids in the 2 to 4 age range, they still have a sense of magical thinking. They might think that they can control death, or they can make things happen or not happen. And they really do take their cues from the adults that are around them. So if adults are talking openly about the person, or if they're crying, and that's okay, kids will take those kind of cues. 2 to 4 years of age, because they lack the language, what you're really looking for is a lot of behavioral kinds of things. So kids, when they lack the language, they speak through their behaviors. So crying and clinginess, being fearful, tantrums and withdrawals. And you might see regressions, so bedwetting or thumb sucking. You might see them talking in a baby language like goo goo gaga, those kinds of things again. And all of those things are pretty common for grieving kids in this age range. It's also very common for kids, all kids really, to have moments where the grief is really, really heavy for them, and they're having these behaviors and they're working their way through. And then just shortly thereafter, they're back to playing normally again and kind of laughing and playing as though nothing has happened. It's not that they aren't understanding that a death happened. This is just how children, especially young children, understand and process grief and loss in small chunks at a time. So, to support a kid in this age range, you can use really concrete, literal terms. So, it's good to use the words like dead, death, and dying. Those are words. If you can help children understand what that means, give them the language to talk about it, it really, truly helps them. Keep routines and familiarity. And kids in this age range really respond well to creative mediums. So you'll see them, they process their emotions through behaviors, but they also process their emotions through play. And so you might see them reading grief books is really good. Might do art projects focused on grief and their feelings, or you might see them playing games where death is a central theme. So you might see them with their Barbies, kind of reliving what they believe happened. And all of those things are really healthy ways that kids process their grief. And to support them, again, I'll say it for every age grade, telling stories, sharing pictures, and regularly talking about the person who died, regularly talking about grief. The more you can keep that open and open lines of communication about all of these feelings, that's really good for kids of all ages. And it's good for adults too. If we can talk about our person who died, we can talk about the emotions and feelings we have that kind of come and go. It's really helpful for our grief process to be able to share our feelings and have them witnessed. And when you can do that within your family unit, it's extra beautiful. Kids age 5 to 10, they are understanding more about death. They've got those concepts are coming more clear, but they might not fully have grasped all of it yet. So kids may still get anxious about death, and this is where as they understand that concept that it's universal and inevitable, kids in this age range might start to worry about other people dying or themselves dying, and they might have a lot of questions about why someone died. And they might also have increased anxiety. They're again looking for those emotions to come out, but they need those safe places. So if they don't have safe places to process their grief, they may be blaming themselves. Anxiety, things like that might come up more so for them. Of course, sadness and all of the emotions that we would expect. And you might still see behavioral changes and regressions happening at this age group as well. Ways to support them, of course, creating that environment of trust where if your child feels they can talk to you about the person who died, they can talk to you about grief, and that it's an okay thing in our house, that it's part of our lives, we can talk about it, and that they can ask questions and have them answered honestly and with facts. Those things are really instrumental to helping a child understand grief and be able to have safe places to talk about it. So yeah, with that age group, just answering their questions and being really open and really honest. And of course, again, telling those stories, sharing those pictures, regularly talking about that person who died. Kids in this age group also benefit if you raise that subject for them. So you might say something like, if they were out, maybe they won an award at karate or something, and you could say, geez, you know what, your dad would be like super proud of you today. Just raising those kinds of things and letting them know that it's okay to talk about their person who died can be really helpful for them. Preteens and teens, this could be an entire another session, so I'm not going to go into too much work. My books really focus on the young kids, but just key to this age of development is knowing that teens are moving towards independence and that they do need that, they have a better idea about what death kind of more like an adult would think about it. But they need those safe places to explore feelings, and peer support can be super helpful for kids in this age. Well, for all kids, but especially for kids in this age group, when they can get together with other kids, whether that's an online virtual group, getting together at a children's bereavement camp, for example, or getting together for an in-person support group. Those kinds of things can be super helpful for teens because we know that they like to process with their peers. And again, keeping those lines of communication open, that it's a-okay to talk about death in our house. It's a-okay to talk about all of the feelings that we have, and it's okay to share stories and tell pictures and talk about a person who died. Those are really good things for kids, right? If we can keep those lines of communication open, it's really helpful for them. So talking about death with children, one of the best things you can do if you are a parent or you're going to be a parent or you support parents in your work roles, is you want to normalize those conversations about death, like well before a dying event happens in a child's life. So something that always stuck in my mind was that it's easier to explain a dead bug than a dead family member. And I always will remember remember that quote because it's very, very true. If you can take opportunities, when your child is young and they're squishing ants on the sidewalk, how many kids do, you can tell them about, that causes the ant to die and the body stops working. And when the body stops working, the ant dies. If you're walking down the street and you happen to see a dead mouse or a bird or something like that, I think as parents, our tendency is to kind of do the wide berth and walk around those. But if you have time and you have opportunity to stop and to point out, look, this bird died, the bird's body died, and that means that it's no longer able to breathe and it won't eat anymore, it won't fly anymore. Those kinds of concepts, you can really help develop that concept in your child. And when a child experiences a death loss, which we know many children do in Canada, I think it's 1 in 14 children will experience the death of a sibling or a parent before they turn 18. That's a big number. And that doesn't even include grandparents or friends, family members, pets. So we know that, death is likely going to be something that many children experience. So we want to start those conversations early so that when it does happen, it's something that they have some baseline, right? Being really direct, simple language, use those words, dead, death, and dying. We want to avoid using euphemisms and talking about kind of really abstract language that's hard for kids. Being open and honest, I think if you can set the stage with your own family that it's okay to talk about the person, it's okay to talk about the feelings you have, and then all your feelings, no matter what they are. And they can be anything, right? We can be sad for sure, but we can also be happy, and we can also be absolutely devastated, and at the same time we can have joy and sorrow and regret and all of those feelings we might be having, and that's okay, right? We can always facilitating that idea of open, honest conversations can be super helpful for kids. And just know that you don't need to be an expert, right? We don't need all the answers, especially, if you're a parent and you're trying to think your way through all of this information and you say, you know what, it's okay to not know the answer, right? Be open to the mystery because there's so much about death that is a mystery. So it's always okay if you say to your child, you know what, I don't know. What do you think about that? Or let them ask them about their thoughts because kids have some cool ideas about death and dying and how it all works. So I encourage you as a parent, do what you can to bring this conversation to the forefront and have it be part of your household from as early as you can. But if you're in this spot where you're needing to explain death to kids, that is kind of why I started writing children's books when I had to explain death to my own kids, even though it's a pretty open topic in our household. It still was hard. It was hard to find the right words. It was hard to kind of get started. And so a good place, because death is so abstract, a good place to start is with the physical. What happened? What does death mean? Put some definitions for kids around death. Being really clear and concise, answering their questions as factually as possible. You don't have to give a lot of detail for kids. I always say a good thing is just start with a small, kind of simple statement and then let them ask their questions, let them process that. It might be enough, just a small, simple thing. And if they have questions, just answer it and build on it from there. And be prepared to repeat yourself because, again, with kids, these concepts, the developmental concepts that they're trying to grow in their brain and place in their brain, sometimes they might ask again and again and again and then again. And that's okay. It's not that you're doing a bad job of explaining things. It's just that they're trying to form these thoughts in their brain. And it might take some repetition for kids. So don't be dismayed if it kind of comes up again and again. Death is not a one-time conversation with kids. In fact, they might ask a lot. Some kids ask tons of questions. The next kid might not ask any, and all of that is okay. But be prepared that, you don't want death to be a one-time conversation. You want to have these conversations and open the flow. And so these conversations can kind of come up again and again. And if they do, that's great. With kids, there's definitely some things you want to avoid when you're talking with them. And again, with our society, the way that we like to talk about grief, the way that we like to kind of shove it in the closet and pretend it doesn't exist. And then when we have no choice but to kind of engage with it, we like to sugarcoat things. We want to make everything better, and we want to fix things. And so we do have this tendency to talk in euphemisms instead of saying words like grandma died. She might say she went to sleep, or they passed away, or he's lost. And for kids, euphemisms are very confusing because they are so concrete. Um, a child who says, if you say to a child she went to sleep, they might really get scared of sleeping, of themselves falling asleep, other people falling asleep. Um, Things get lost, but then they're found again all the time, right? Like kids lose shoes. So you want to avoid euphemisms and avoid that kind of flowery language we like to use when we as adults feel uncomfortable. You also don't want to sugarcoat things for kids. So by saying, you know what, she's in a better place, for kids, what they're hearing is that there's a better place than being with them. And that can confuse kids and can be hard for them to process and make their grief a little bit harder than it needs to be. And you also want to avoid using vague terms. So when you say things like she got old or sick, um, kids might really worry, if a friend at school gets a cold and they're sick, that they're going to die. And so it's really important to just put descriptors on that for kids. Why did the person die? They died because they had cancer, those kinds of things. And being really kind of giving them the details so that they can process small amounts of details, but enough that they can kind of process that idea of what happened. That there's a physical reason why people, a cause and a physical reason. You also want to avoid introducing concepts. So if you're the parent or the guardian of the child, you can introduce concepts for sure. Spirituality and culture are so unique to each and every person. But if you're not in that immediate circle and you're not that child's guardian or their parent, then you want to avoid using terms like you have an angel watching over you, even they've gone to heaven, or God needed them more. And we say these things out of a place of love, and we say these things out of a place of compassion, but we can't assume what a family's belief system is and how much of that belief system they've shared with their young child. So children might, if children hear that, and they might want to know, where is heaven, if they've never heard of that before? Why can't they go there? And they don't understand all of that. And it's something that absolutely can be helpful for children, but it is a concepts like these should always be introduced by their family. So I always say that with just a word of caution. We say these things out of a good place, but it can be hard for children to understand and kind of confusing for them too. And another thing that we often say, and we say this to grievers of all ages, we say things like, you need to be strong, don't cry, they wouldn't want you to be sad. And all of those things really for children are just putting pressure on them about how they express their grief, about what's appropriate and not appropriate. So children don't need to be strong for their parents. They need to be children. And it's okay to cry, but it's also okay to be happy, and it's okay to have all of the emotions of grief. And we'll be sad, but it's okay to play too, right? So okay. But you kind of want to avoid telling children to be strong, because they don't need to be strong. They need to be small, and they need to be cared for. So defining death. So some simple words, right? We're wanting to find the right words for how to explain death to kids. A really good place to start is the physical piece. So death means the body stopped working. And when that body stops working, all of the bodily functions stop working. We want to make sure they understand that. The person doesn't feel pain. When the body is buried, they're not going to be cold. The body's not going to move. It's not going to come back to life, because death is permanent. And we also want them to know, why did this happen, right? So you might say something like, grandma's body stopped working, or grandma's body died, and that means her body stopped working inside. Grandma's body no longer moves, doesn't eat or breathe. feel pain. And when the body dies, it will never start working again. And you want to let them know grandma died because her body had a disease called cancer, and that caused her body to stop working inside. The cancer caused her body to stop working. I use terms like that, right? And you don't need to use this as a script. You can kind of whatever feels right for you, but focusing on that, right? The body stopped working, the body functions stop. This is permanent, and there was a cause. There was a reason why this happened. If you can talk about that with your kids, you can really help them understand that concept of death, can understand that why did this happen and what happens when someone dies? What does that mean? And help them start to process that. So there's a helpful reference point, I think, for kids. Kids, when you introduce a concept like death and you talk about them, there's been some research that says, kids have some common concerns that come up for them. So this is the 5 C's of grieving children. And this is really the informational needs that kids need to know that can help them with their grief process. So part of that is a lot of kids might wonder, did I cause it? Can I catch it? Can I cure it? Who will care for me? And how will I stay connected? And children, if you can give them information in these 5 realms, you can provide reassurances to them in these 5 realms, that can help with their ability to understand what happened and their ability to process what happened. So you might reassure a child if they're wondering, did I cause it? You might want to reassure them, right? This was not your fault. This was a thing that happened. It had nothing to do with you. Because kids do have that element of magical thinking. They might think that, I did something bad and then they died and they left and it was my fault. So for kids, you can really reassure them. Providing that reassurance can be helpful for them to say, no, this had nothing to do, you didn't cause it, and it had nothing to do with you, and it's no one's fault that this death happened. Kids, especially now in the COVID world, they worry about catching death. So it's important to reassure a child, if it's appropriate, of course, that the person died and it's not contagious, that the child isn't going to die by going to visit grandma who has cancer, that cancer is not contagious. And you can also help them to understand that other people in their lives, children, a lot of them do worry that other people will die. They'll catch death, and they will also worry about that too. So it's important. You can also say, like, if your child asks, are you going to die too? You don't want to lie, obviously. You'll say death, someday we all die, but I'm hoping that I won't die for a very long time because my body is healthy, and things like that, providing that kind of reassurance to them. Children also want reassurance, or they worry about themselves, because children tend to be a little bit egocentric in their thinking. They do worry, how will I still get to swim practice? Can I go to school? Who's going to care for me, right? And who will care for me if something happens to you? Sometimes kids do worry about those things. So providing reassurance that I will always be there to take care of you. And if for some reason I wasn't, you also have helps. Your teachers will be there, other family members, other friends, that so many people love you, and you're not alone in this whole thing, so that you'll still be cared for, still be taken care of. And especially considering things like if the person who died was central to taking them to practice, central to maybe doing things with them, that they'll still be able to do those things, even in the absence of their person, if it's at all possible. And finally, they worry about staying connected. And so kids do worry about that. And it's important for them to know that they will be able to still talk about their person, that it's okay to talk about their person, and that those continued connections, we can remember our person. We'll do things like rituals, and we'll remember them at Christmas, and we'll do things like that because they're always going to be a part of you, in your heart and in your memories, or whatever belief system is appropriate for your family, right? So kids do worry about those things. If you can reassure them in these kind of realms, as their questions come up, kind of always thinking about this in the back of your mind, that can be really helpful for them and their grief process. A lot of people wonder about letting children participate, and this is just a really quick note to say that, yeah, kids, let them participate. It's healthy for kids. If they want to be present at the deathbed, they want to participate in end of life rituals or the funeral. That giving kids the opportunity to be part of it is helpful for them and helpful for their grieving process. It's really helpful to them. Give them some tips. What might they see? Kind of prepare them ahead of time, right? That idea that preparation is protection. Let them know what they might see or hear or how other people might be acting when they get there. Might have some contingency plans if they don't feel comfortable. Is there a family member or friend or someone that could take them home? But never forced. So for kids, if they do not want, they're not interested in seeing a person, or they're not interested in going to a funeral, or they're having a lot of anxieties around things like that, we don't want to force them to do those things either. So let kids participate at the level they feel comfortable at, but don't push them beyond that comfort zone, because that can be hard for them and it's not always necessary. If they don't go to funerals and things like that, you can always take a lot of pictures and videos, pick up things like some flowers or things like that, or find a different ritual that you can let your child participate in a way that they feel comfortable. So, but yeah, it's healthy for kids to be involved, and it's okay if they don't want to be as well. So for kids, the collection, my storybook collection, the title of it is Puddle Jumper Publishing, and it's because of this really brilliant quote. Um, that is, for adults, grief is like wading through an enormous river, whereas for kids, it is puddle jumping. But when they're in that puddle, it is no different to the river. And really, what that means is kids do tend to grieve in small chunks at a time. So, for adults, when we are grieving or experiencing grief, it's kind of all encompassing and it kind of swallows us whole. And for a little while, we're kind of floundering in this river. But for kids, kids tend to process things in small chunks at a time. So, more like a puddle, they'll be jumping in it. And when they're in that puddle, in those feelings, the sadness and the guilt and the anger and regret and joy and sorrow, all of those things, whatever their feelings are, they might be feeling it really, really strong. But then just a few minutes later, they might jump right back out of it, might ask a couple questions, they might express their feelings, they might express through play and through behaviors or words. But then shortly after, they move on to another task and they're back to playing. And it stays that kind of jumping in and jumping out. And that's how kids tend to explore their feelings of grief. And I think for adults, it's really important to recognize that kids' grief, the way that it looks, the way that it plays out, is very different than adults. And so it's not odd. I think a lot of people often say, well, my kid doesn't seem to care. They do care and they are grieving, but how they explore their grief, how they tell you, show you about their grief is something to be mindful of. So just always supporting them and normalizing them, having open feelings and talking about your feelings. And one thing for your children that can be super helpful is having adults that model that. So absolutely, it's okay for you to cry in front of your kids. If you're having a really good memory and something tears you up, and you want to share that with them. That can be really helpful for kids to model that. And it's also helpful for the adults involved in their lives to bring up opportunities for them to explore their feelings, by saying things like, you know what, this was really cool, or you know what, this was your person's favorite meal. Do you want to make it today? Or things like that. Be super helpful for kids. And kids, because of the way they process their grief, a lot of kids aren't going to want to sit down and talk about their feelings at a scheduled time. Kids' grief kind of comes and goes. And so you're always wanting to open and maintain those lines of communication that sometimes the best conversations are going to come up on the way to school, in the car, before bed, when you're sitting down and playing Lego. That's when these kind of thoughts might come up and the discussions might come up. So just follow your child's lead when you can. Take those opportunities when they want to, when they've kind of shown you through their behaviors that they're wanting to talk about grief. You can tell stories, share pictures. On the electronic candle, I always say electronic because those are safer. Things like breathing, meditations, guided meditations, there's lots of those free online. Those things are great for kids. Following through with your cultural and spiritual traditions, paying special attentions to holidays and other events, special events, because even happy events can bring up grief for kids, and finding ways to honor that missing person by just even saying, you know what, it's something, it's hard when we all gather together. We notice even more when someone is gone, and just validating that for kids, and giving them tangible hands-on tools. So art activities and projects are really, really good. Books, kids grief books, memory boxes are another really helpful thing that you can do with kids. But we want to give them those spaces and open up that environment where it's okay to talk about all these things. Again, when you're a parent, you're a caregiver, you don't need to know all the answers, right? You just need to be open to exploring, and open to having those conversations with your kid, and knowing that grief is a lifelong journey for them, right? So even when they're little, you want to set them up with that ability, and set them up with that skill set, and set them up with that concept that when grief comes in the waves that it comes in, that you're there for them, and you're going to talk about it with them. And that can also be helpful for your own grief. Because being a parent, or a caregiver, and also while you're experiencing your own grief, is very overwhelming, and it can be really, really hard for people. Um, so that concept of putting on your own oxygen first before you assist others, really important. You need to focus on your self-care, give time to your own grief process. And that's not always easy when you're a parent and you're busy and you're trying to support your own grieving child. But it's important that you take care of yourself. So there are supports out there. There are really good resources and strategies. You can involve, obviously your support system. If you have a friend that maybe you could take your kid to swimming practice, and that gives you an hour to just focus on your own grief and focus on just self-care time, really, really can be super helpful. So let your support system in, to help your child, but also to help yourself in grief, right? Um, you can also involve support systems. So you might have support available to you at the school. So it might be beneficial to you to phone the school's guidance counselor and say, I have, this has happened. This is going on with my kid. Is there services like counseling, or is there anything the school can do to help you out? You can also explore some really good free resources. And I have a Canadian list here. The Canadian Virtual Hospice kidsgrief.ca, regardless of whether you're in Canada or not, really good resources to learn about kids grief. There's a parent portal in there where you can go in and actually take an online course to learn about talking about death and grief and how to support your child. So that is hands down one of my favorite resources out there. And as well as mygrief.ca, there's courses you can go in and learn about your own grief too. And I think so important. The Canadian Alliance for Grieving Children and Youth, you can go onto that website and actually click in and find some activities. So if you've got some arts things you want to do, some crafts or activities or ways of remembering people on the holidays, some really child-friendly activities, you can click into there and find some super fabulous things to do with your kid that you can do yourself. You don't need too many things. The Children and Youth Grief Network of Canada and the Children's Grief Foundation of Canada, again, also two really good resources. You can click in there and you can actually find professional support services. So if you're looking for a child's bereavement camp or a grief support group or a grief support specialist, you can access some really good Canadian-based resources in there. If you're not in Canada today, you're joining us from the UK or the States, places like that. A lot of places do have local resources as well. So you can hop into Google and just type in children's grief or children's bereavement plus support services and then your area. And you'll be surprised to find that in a lot of places, there are really good resources out there. So just quickly at the end, I am going to share a read through of my storybook. I Am Here For You, a story to support your grieving child through death from suicide. This is a first story in a collection of resources that I'm developing for families. Available now. The first one is available now, the death from suicide. However, in the next little bit, you're going to see books coming for substance use, natural causes, an unexpected or a sudden death, homicide, MAID, cancer, and the pregnancy and infant death of a sibling. So I'm working my way up, and I'm going to share with you the first book. A lot of the information that we talked about in our time together today is contained in this book. There's activities, places for photos and tips. There's also a lot of support suggestions for kids that you'll find in there. There's also a reader's guide to give you some tips that you can do with your child. So in the activity, I apologize. This is the first time I've done a live read, so bear with me while I figure this out. The books have imageries, real life things kids can recognize, things like Play-Doh and books like that. So I'm going to do a little bit of a live read. And if you are interested, you can always visit my website, Puddle Jumper Publishing, or connect with me and to learn more about the books and maybe see some images and stuff more closer up. But I'll just do a little bit of a read through. We're not going to look at the tips. At the bottom of each page, there's tips about the 5 C's, things to learn about and read about. But I'll do a little bit of a live read, and hopefully you can see the pictures. A sad thing has happened. Come sit by my side when you want to talk about your person who died. You won't make me upset. I like to talk about them too, even if I get tears in my eyes when we do. It is okay to talk about how your person died. Talking can help us feel better inside. I am here for you. A tree starts as a seed that grows to the sky. One day it falls down because living things die. Trees die in nature for many different reasons, like diseases and accidents, or the passing of seasons. This tree was in a storm where nasty winds blew. The tree bent and it broke. Then it died like trees do. I am here for you. All living things will die. Yes, this is true. It happens to plants, animals, pets, and people too. People usually die when they grow to old age, but death can happen at any time or stage. Death means the body has stopped working inside. It happens to all living things, like your person who died. Your person died from suicide. In their brain, a deep sorrow made them believe they couldn't live until tomorrow. Suicide happens when thoughts get stuck inside the mind that makes the world seem hopeless and very unkind. Your person caused their own body to stop working by suicide. They hoped those thoughts would stop if they died. I'm here for you. From the bottom of the feet to the top of the head, the body doesn't move when it's dead. The heart doesn't beat, the lungs don't breathe air, the body doesn't talk or eat, walk, feel, or grow hair. Your person's body stopped working. It won't come back to life one day. When the body is dead, it stays that way. I want you to know, even though the adults are sad, this didn't happen because of anything you thought, said, or did bad. Suicide is hard to understand. We don't always know why. We wish we could change it and not say goodbye. Your person's death was not your fault, you see. We could not have stopped it, not you and not me. When your person died, it changed many things. Grief is the mixed up thoughts and feelings death brings. Grief can make you cry tears when you feel upset or sad. Grief can make you shout when you feel angry or mad. Grief can be confusing. Your shoulders might shrug. And grief can be scary. You might want to hug. I'm here for you. Grief can make you feel guilty, like you've done something wrong. Grief can come and go, and the feeling can last long. How grief feels can change, depending on the day. In grief, we can still be happy, smile, laugh, and play. Did you know that adults have grief feelings too? I miss your person, just like you do. I'm here for you. I will love you no matter how your grief feels each day. I'm always here to listen and help you on the way. Things will get better. Together we'll cope. We have each other to heal and share hope. You are not alone. Many people care. Your friends, family, and teachers will also be there. I'm here for you. One thing I know is your person loved you. Will never forget how special they are to you. Will remember your person by speaking their name and doing the things they loved, like a special meal or a game. We will stay connected through stories, pictures, and art, because remembering them keeps them in your heart. So thank you for letting me share this storybook with you. I'm Here for You is a collection, a storybook collection that I'm working on now to help children understand death. They are topic based. So this particular book is about death from suicide, but like I mentioned, there are some more storybooks coming to the collection. Each of my storybooks come in pronoun options to memorialize the person who died. I feel like it's very important that we have inclusive representation in death and grief resources. So you'll see that each of my books, they come in the pronoun options she, he, and they to memorialize the person who died. Within the books, I think I have a couple more minutes to finish up. Within the books, you'll be able to see that there are tips for reading the book with your child, and there's also information about the 5 C's so that you can kind of understand how this book was developed and what it is based on. Again, clinical practice, but I'm a mom and I know that kids love things like Play-Doh and they love seeing things that they can draw in and read in. So one of the places in the books here, there's lots of spaces where kids can glue in pictures. They can write who this book belongs to and who it's in memory of. At the back of the book, there's spaces for the child to write their own grief stories so they can document who their person was, things that they know about the death and how did that happen, the information that kids need to know so that they can process death, that it's okay to talk about their feelings. There's also space in there, so things to remember about their favorite person. They can write down some information. There's also information, so the things we talked about today about how they can remember their person, some suggestions for kids' grief activities, and things that they can do to, when they do have feelings, how can they help with their feelings in healthy ways that support expression and it supports them talking. And then there is a resource list as well. So there are some resources you can go into to find and explore kids' grief. And then finally, in the back of the book, there's lots of spaces, a couple of pages for kids to glue in their favorite photos, or they might want to tuck in letters that they write to their person, or other special memories that they might have. So that's my book, and thank you, my first of my book, and I appreciate the opportunity so much to be here with you guys today. Certainly, if you are interested in learning about the books, my information, you can learn more at puddlejumperpublishing.com. You can also find me on my email, is puddlejumperpublishing@gmail.com. If you want to send me over some, or if you have any questions after today, I don't see any in the comment box. I hope I'm seeing all the comment boxes right. And oh, there you go. Thanks. And you can also find me. I'm on social media, so you can also find my social media pages. I have a Facebook page called Puddle Jumper Publishing, and I'm also under the same name on Instagram and TikTok. And on the daily basis, I do on our TikTok page, we talk about grief, and on our Instagram page, what I do there is share a lot of resources and tips. So especially if you're in Canada, but I do, if there's stuff that I see from some of my other networks, I do share out free resources and events for kids, and free educational opportunities where people can pop in and learn more about children's grief. And of course, on our Facebook page, we share information and support there as well. So, and that's usually where I would share information about our upcoming books. I'm looking at launching my next story here, which will be I'm Here for You, a story to support your grieving child through death from substance use, in not too long, in the next couple of months here. That book will be available. So thank you, and thank you again to all the event organizers and to everyone who has come together to participate in this really awesome event and to share their information and their resources. I know I've learned so much from being able to hear from others And I hope that you've taken away some things from today that will help you in terms of supporting the grieving children in your life. So thank you.